Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Build-a-Klip tutorial. My name is Zach Kath-Nelson. I'm the Director of Growth with Klipfolio, and today we're going to introduce a few more concepts into this clip that we've been building. We're going to add a little bit more complexity, introduce a few new chart types, and a few other ways to manipulate your data and showcase it for your users. Let's get started. We're going to open up this clip that we built earlier. And the first time around, we simply chose a label component and we added that to our clip. We're going to introduce a few new elements today. And the first one is called a layout grid. So I'm going to take that and drag it into the middle. A layout grid gives you a number of rows and columns that you can use to design and lay out your clip exactly as it exists on your napkin drawing. And again, to showcase the data to the users in the best possible way. So we can add as many rows or columns as we need to our layout grid. These are basically independent workspaces. And every row or column in our chart, we can decide occupies a certain number of columns or a certain number of rows. So I'll create a little bit more space for us at the top right. And that label that we built earlier, I'm going to grab that and move it into this workspace here. This is just going to make it look nice and clean. Next, we're going to introduce a separator component. This is just a simple visual element that we can use to visually break up the different elements in the clip that we're building. So I've brought the separator into one of the cells of our layout grid. With the layout panel, I can specify that this occupies a certain number of columns. We can also make it a little bit thicker so it stands out and change the color however we need. Next, let's introduce a bar and line chart. So I'm going to find that in the component palette and click and drag it into our working area. And just like the separator, I have to navigate to the bar line chart element of our component tree. By the way, as you add any new element into your working area in the middle, you'll see the component tree or the table of contents continue to grow. And this is a great way to navigate through the different areas of the clip that you're building. So just like I did for the separator, on the bar line chart, I'm going to choose the layout panel. And again, specify that this occupies all 3 columns of our layout grid. With a bar line chart, I always like to start by working with the x-axis. I'm going to choose column A from our data so we can showcase all the different dates and see those across the bottom of our chart. Now, when you're working with dates, you've got a number of really nice options. You can see that as of now, the data is appearing on the chart exactly as it exists in the data set, in the format year, month, and day. And we've just got that same data format up here, year, month, and day. And while that is accurate, it might not be the best way to showcase the data to the users. So let's navigate over to the Properties panel. We can see that Klipfolio has recognized the date format as it's coming in, but we also have a really simple way of customizing how the data is shown to the users. You've got a lot of preset options here. If we wanted to break it down by month and year, we can choose this second option. I find myself often doing this. It's a nice compact way of showing the data, very readable for the users, and it's also going to allow us to roll up all this data and aggregate it by month and year. So I'm going to choose that. So we can see this data come to life, and it might not be easy to see. We see one example over here. We've got a lot of data on this chart, and Klipfolio is smartly only showing the data that fits, but behind the scenes there's a lot of repeating values, and I can see an example right here. So there are a number of actions that I'm going to want to take to clean this up. I have access to those in this Properties panel down here. A few of the things that I'm going to want to do are to group the labels to remove the repeating values. And also, I see this blank space at the start. That is caused by the fact that our data has a column header. So those are two of the actions I'm going to want to take, group and filter. And I have access to both of those down in the Properties panel. I find myself generally accessing those two things up here in the component tree. I'm going to right-click on the x-axis, and first I'm going to group this data together to remove all of the repeating values. And next, I'm going to apply a simple filter. The filter might be where you specify certain months that you want to include or exclude. In our case here, we want to simply grab the column header that's represented by this blank. Klipfolio doesn't recognize a date format in the column header, so we just call it blank. And I'm going to exclude it. Whenever you want to remove something, it's always better to select the one thing that you want to exclude and take this approach instead of an approach like this, where we basically select everything and leave one thing unchecked. The reason is that if new data gets added to this data source that wasn't there earlier, by simply excluding one thing, what we're saying is that every other data element should be included. So this is the approach we want to take to remove something. So let's do that. We can see that the blank space we saw at the start has been removed. The last thing I'm going to want to do is set the label rows and label angle to auto. This is just going to allow Klipfolio to smartly show the x-axis in an optimal way based on how many data elements are there and how large the clip is. This looks pretty good to me so far. Next, let's navigate over to our series. On the data panel, we can show any data element that we want. Because this clip is our revenue data, let's choose the revenue column. And we can immediately see our data come to life. When we hover over any of the bars, we're going to see a nice simple tooltip. Let's give this series a name so that it shows up in our tooltip. And we need to do that in the Properties panel. Let's also override the automatically set format so we can specify that this is a currency. And now when we hover over the data, we're going to see a nice clean tooltip showing our revenue per month. What we can optionally do is show the values on the chart to add a little bit more context for our users. This is sort of a personal preference, and you are going to want to be mindful of how the data looks. We don't want to overwhelm the users with information, which is definitely a possibility when you've got a lot of elements on a chart. In this situation, I'm going to leave it without the values. The next thing we're going to do is from the bar line chart, we have the option to add an additional series. So let's add that here. There are a lot of different ways we can showcase it. The first bar was showing our revenue figures, which are quite large numbers compared to quantity. If we wanted to show another series with quantity, we can do that, and I've successfully done that here. We can't see it on the chart though, because as you see, our axis along the left contains numbers that are very, very large. So first, we've added a series here for quantity. Let's give this a good label so we'll be able to see it. And in order to show it on the chart, what we're going to want to do is add a new y-axis. So from the bar and line chart level in the component tree, we're going to add a second y-axis, and we're going to call this quantity. Then from our quantity series in the Properties panel, we can specify to use the quantity axis, and now we can see our data much more clearly. To help our users interpret this chart, when we look at each of our y-axes in the Properties panel, we can choose to show these on the clip itself, So our first axis we're going to call revenue, and we'll show that axis title. You can see it appear on the left. Our second axis, quantity. We'll show that, and you see it appear on the right. You give up a little bit of screen real estate in order to show these, but what you gain is a clearer view for your users. That brings us to the end of this second tutorial. A quick tip: while you are editing an existing clip that you've been working on, you can click this small button just to the right of the Save and Exit button and save the work you've been doing so you don't lose any progress while you stay in the clip editor. To recap what we covered today, we built on some simple concepts that we introduced in the first video in this series by adding a layout grid to give you a number of independent workspaces to design your clip exactly as you need. We introduced the separator component to introduce a little visual distinction between the different elements in your clip. We brought in a bar line chart and grouped and filtered the data on the x-axis, as well as added two different series based on very different scales in order to show different data points on the same chart with corresponding axes. Thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for part 3 in our series where we will introduce a few new concepts. Thanks very much, and have a great day. To recap what we covered today, we built on some simple concepts that we introduced in the first video in this series by adding a layout grid to give you a number of independent workspaces to design your clip exactly as you need. We introduced the separator component to introduce a little visual distinction between the different elements in your clip. We brought in a bar line chart and grouped and filtered the data on the x-axis, as well as added two different series based on very different scales in order to show different data points on the same chart with corresponding axes. Thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for part 3 in our series where we will introduce a few new concepts. Thanks very much, and have a great day.